While other armies searched for machines to break the deadlock of trench warfare, the Germans chose a far more radical approach. Instead of building new weapons, they created a new kind of soldier, one trained to move faster, strike harder, and disappear before the enemy could react. But the very thing that made them so effective is what ultimately doomed them. Because with every success, they were sent on more dangerous missions, until there was almost no one left to go. This is the story of the Stormtroopers. When the war began in the summer of 1914, it was expected to unfold in a way that had defined European warfare for generations, with sweeping movements, rapid advances, and decisive battles that would settle the conflict before it could settle into something prolonged. But within a matter of months, that expectation began to collapse under the reality of modern weapons that made movement not just difficult, but devastatingly costly. Machine guns transformed open ground into killing zones where advancing infantry could be cut down before they even reached the enemy line, while artillery, now faster and more destructive than ever before, dominated the battlefield to such an extent that entire areas could be reduced to chaos long before an assault even began. And barbed wire, simple but effective, locked attacking units in place, leaving them exposed at the worst possible moment. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had solidified into a continuous line stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a vast system of trenches that would define the war for years, and what followed was not a series of decisive maneuvers, but a grinding process in which both sides attempted to break the other through sheer attrition. The method was repeated again and again, with long periods of artillery bombardment intended to destroy defenses and weaken morale, followed by waves of infantry advancing across no man's land under the assumption that the enemy had already been neutralized. But in practice, the defenders simply waited out the bombardment in deep dugouts, emerging as soon as it lifted, ready to meet attackers who were now fully exposed. Even when an attack succeeded and a trench was taken, the result rarely lasted, because the units that had managed to reach the objective were often too depleted to hold it, allowing counterattacks to push them back within hours, and so the front returned to its original position, while the cost of each attempt continued to rise. It became increasingly clear that repeating the same approach would not produce a different outcome, and across the front, a new idea began to take shape, one that suggested that success might not come from mass, but from movement, from smaller groups that could exploit weaknesses instead of attacking strength directly. At first, these efforts were improvised, carried out by small raiding parties that crossed no man's land under the cover of darkness or fog, moving quietly through gaps in the wire to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, or disrupt the enemy's defensive system. And although many armies experimented with these tactics, it was the Germans who pushed the concept further, gradually turning it from improvisation into doctrine. Early attempts to formalize the idea, however, revealed just how difficult that transition would be. Because the first dedicated assault units were equipped with heavy protective gear intended to shield them from incoming fire, yet on the battlefield, this equipment proved to be more of a burden than an advantage, slowing movement and limiting flexibility at the exact moment when both were most needed. When these units were thrown into combat under pressure, they suffered heavy losses, and it might have seemed that the concept itself had failed, but instead it forced a fundamental reassessment of what actually worked, and it was at this point that leadership and thinking began to shift in a direction that would define everything that followed. Under the command of Willy Raw, the surviving elements of these early units were reorganized with a completely different priority, abandoning the idea that protection would ensure survival and replacing it with the understanding that mobility, speed, and initiative offered a far better chance of success in the environment of trench warfare. The equipment changed accordingly, with shorter weapons replacing longer rifles, grenades becoming central to how assaults were conducted, and specialized roles introduced to ensure that each small group could operate effectively on its own, supported by machine guns, flamethrowers, and soldiers trained specifically for close-quarters combat. Training also shifted in a way that reflected this new approach, as men practiced not in open formations, but within constructed trench systems designed to replicate real conditions, where every movement had to be deliberate, every signal understood without words, and every action coordinated within a small unit that might find itself operating far ahead of the main force. When these methods were put to the test in 1915, the difference was immediate, not because the fighting itself was less intense, but because it unfolded differently, beginning with shorter, more focused artillery strikes that disrupted defenders without giving them time to fully prepare, followed by small groups advancing independently, using the terrain for cover and maintaining momentum instead of waiting for orders. As they reached enemy positions, they relied on speed and coordination, using grenades to clear sections of trench before entering them, and rather than attempting to capture every position they encountered, they moved past resistance where possible, pushing deeper into the defensive system, isolating strong points instead of attacking them directly, and leaving them to be dealt with later by follow-up forces. This approach proved that trench warfare could be broken, at least temporarily, but it also placed those carrying it out in a position of constant exposure, because they were always the first to advance, the first to engage, and the most likely to encounter resistance at close range. By 1916, these tactics were no longer experimental, and at Verdun, they were applied on a scale that brought them into full view, as assault units moved forward in coordination with shorter, more intense artillery preparation, exploiting confusion rather than waiting for it to settle, and pushing deeper into enemy positions than had previously been possible. The capture of Fort Douaumont illustrated this shift in a way that few events could, not because it was taken through overwhelming force, but because it was entered through an unexpected opening, with a small group exploiting a moment of vulnerability that had gone unnoticed and securing one of the most important defensive positions without the kind of battle that would normally have been required. From that point on, the psychological impact of these tactics became as important as their physical effect, because defenders could no longer be certain that the front line defined the battle or that what lay behind them was secure. By 1917, the concept had spread throughout the German army, influencing how units were structured and how attacks were conducted, while other nations began to adopt similar methods, recognizing that flexibility and coordination at the small unit level could produce results that mass alone could not achieve. At Caporetto, these ideas reached a level of effectiveness that demonstrated both their potential and their consequences, as coordinated attacks combined artillery, gas, and rapid movement to disrupt the Italian front in a way that caused not just localized breakthroughs, but a broader collapse of structure and command. The speed of the advance, combined with the inability of defenders to understand where the main effort was focused, created a situation in which entire units found themselves isolated and surrounded before they could react. And the result was a scale of surrender and disintegration that few had expected. By early 1918, Germany sought to apply these methods on an even larger scale, attempting to achieve a decisive breakthrough before external factors could shift the balance of the war, and Operation Michael represented the most ambitious version of that effort, combining overwhelming firepower with the now developed tactics of infiltration and rapid movement. Initially, the results appeared to justify the approach, as sections of the front that had remained static for years began to give way, allowing advances that had previously seemed impossible, but the very speed of that movement created new problems as supply lines struggled to keep up and the coordination required to sustain momentum became increasingly difficult. Unlike earlier operations, in which assault units could be relieved after achieving their objectives, the scale of this offensive required them to continue advancing without pause, placing them under constant pressure and gradually eroding the effectiveness that had made them so successful in the first place. Losses mounted, not only from combat, but from exhaustion and overextension, and as experienced soldiers were lost, the ability to carry out these complex operations declined, reducing the impact of subsequent attacks and leaving the broader offensive without the sharp edge it had relied on. By mid-1918, the initiative had shifted, as Allied forces adapted to these methods and began to apply similar principles in combination with new technologies, reversing the dynamic that had once favored the Germans and forcing a retreat that would continue until the end of the war. When the conflict ended, the stormtrooper units themselves were disbanded, but the ideas they had embodied did not disappear, instead evolving into a broader understanding of how small, coordinated units could operate within larger systems, shaping military thinking long after the trenches of the First World War had fallen silent. They had demonstrated that even the most static battlefield could be broken through movement, timing, and precision, but they had also shown that methods built on constant pressure and forward momentum carried their own limits, because the sharper the edge becomes, the more quickly it is worn down.